Anything that creates stress in the body yields exactly the same response. And what is that response? Prepare for famine. That's how humans have survived through all these thousands of years. You don't have to be super smart. You just have to be super effective in terms of utilizing the energy and slowing your metabolism when you're faced with famine. That's why Homo sapiens have not become extinct and Neanderthals became extinct, even though they were smarter than Homo sapiens. Because if there's no food around, it doesn't matter what your IQ is. How is your body going to utilize what's available? So when you're under stress, your metabolism will naturally slow, so that since it's assuming that you're not going to have food, so you've got to then slow your metabolism, like a brownout if you have a heat and they say, don't turn on the air conditioner, use less, right? So you're going to slow your metabolism so that whatever fat stores you have will last longer.
Welcome to the Woman's Doctor podcast, helping empower women to embrace their body and soul's full potential. I'm your host, Dr. Trevor Cates, and after 22 years of working with patients, I found the answers to our health struggles are much deeper than most people realize. To help explore this, I'm interviewing colleagues and other wellness experts to get to the root cause so women can realize their true beauty and be informed decision makers for themselves and their loved ones. Hormonal imbalances impact all women at some point in their lives, and for most of the women I've seen in my practice, this is an ongoing issue. Since hormones are both important and complex, I'm sharing today's interview to help you understand more about your hormones. Today's interview is from an interview I did for the Hormones, Health, and Harmony docu-series. We were only able to share clips of interviews, but there's some footage that didn't make it into the series, but I want to share with you because it's so important. Today's podcast is with Dr. Felice Gersh. She is an OBGYN who has a passionate belief in holistic women's healthcare, and she received a fellowship in Integrative Medicine from the University of Arizona. She was one of the first dual board certified integrative gynecologists in the United States. In this interview, Dr. Gersh shares how hormones play a role in our mood, weight, and metabolism, and why women tend to put on more weight than men. She also shares what her favorite hormone is and why she calls this the master hormone. To learn how to get access to watch this entire interview and over 50 other interviews from the series, go to hormoneseries.com/get-access. Here is today's episode of the Woman's Doctor podcast.
When you think of hormones, a lot of people don't really realize what they do. They're really information delivery systems. When they're called endocrine, then they're made in one organ and then they go into the bloodstream and get distributed throughout the body and work on receptors in different organs on the cells to create an effect. And they're delivering information to that cell, directing the cell to do some kind of action, like produce a peptide or some other protein to do something. Now, hormones that can work locally are called paracrine. So many organs in the body can make their own hormones, and they don't circulate throughout the body, so we don't measure them if we do blood tests or urine tests or any kind of test. They're made locally and then work within that organ itself. That's called paracrine. And there are even cells that can make hormones, and that's called intracrine. But usually when we're talking about the reproductive lives of women and even what goes on through their menopausal transition, we're referring to an endocrine situation, the hormones produced in the ovary, which circulate throughout the body, creating all kinds of effects in every organ system.
How do hormones play a role in our mood?
Hormones play a huge role in mood, and it's not well recognized. Women, for example, have a dramatically higher incidence of both anxiety and depression compared to men. There are hormone receptors throughout all the neurological systems of the body. As well, there are hormone receptors on the immune cells of the body that regulate the inflammatory response, which also have an interplay with the neurons. So if we take the brain, So there are receptors involved in the hypothalamus, which does things like regulate how you produce hormones. So it regulates your menstrual cycle. As well, it regulates your appetite. So women are much more prone when they have hormonal dysregulation to develop binge eating disorder and anorexia because the hormones actually impact on how our appetite systems are working. Then the cortex of the brain, which involves thinking, also has estrogen receptors and progesterone, and as well the areas that deal with emotions, the limbic system, and the hippocampus involved in memory. So all of these parts of the brain have hormone receptors. So when you don't have the proper hormonal balance, it's going to have a huge impact. As well, it turns out that estrogen is key in the form of estradiol, the form that's made by the ovaries, to maintain the production of very important neurotransmitters in the brain. For example, serotonin. So there are actually neurons that are called serotonin neurons. And in order for them to produce this really key for mood regulation neurotransmitter, you need to have adequate amounts of estradiol. So if you have endocrine disruptors that are disrupting the way that the hormones are working, or if you have a deficiency either through like hypothalamic amenorrhea due to most commonly anorexia, or of course menopause, which is universal for every woman, then this will definitely have a huge impact. Then we have this whole other neurological system called the autonomic nervous system that involves the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. And in women, they tend more towards sympathetic output, which is like the stress response. It makes you feel anxious and edgy all the time if it's consistent, and constant through one's life. Of course, it's there to keep us surviving, so that we'll be on edge if we're threatened by some outside force, like an animal potentially going to attack us and such. And the parasympathetic comes from what's called the vagus nerve. It's like a big finger of the brain that comes down and that has branches that go everywhere, including to like the bladder and to the GI tract, to all the reproductive organs, to the heart. And the sympathetic ganglion that put out the sympathetic tone are throughout the body and have linkage through neurons as well through these different nerve passages. So what happens is that when women have emotions, it affects their organs. So that's why people like women who have a lot of stress, emotions, depression, anxiety, they often have irritable bowel syndrome. They often have urinary frequency because all of these neurons relate both to emotions and to the function of organs. So you can see how hormones have this incredible interplay between the functionality of all the organ systems of the body as well as cognition, our ability to think things through, and our emotions. And women are just filled with emotions. And for so many years, I know I was always taught that was sort of an inferior state of being, but not anymore. I embrace it. It's who we are, and we feel more. We have more emotions, and it's very related to our hormones. But of course, on the other side, the flip side, if our hormones are imbalanced, our emotions become terribly imbalanced.
Do you have a favorite hormone?
I have 4 kids, and I've always been told you're not supposed to have a favorite kid, although every mother knows from day to day we might have a favorite kid. We just don't tell the others, But as an OBGYN, I am entitled to have a favorite hormone. It is absolutely, definitively estrogen. But not just all estrogen. It's the special form that's made by the ovaries, which is estradiol. Now, I recognize the other forms of estrogen are also important. They have a role to play. Like in pregnancy, the dominant estrogen is estriol. So, of course, I love pregnancy and all that it represents. But most of the life of a woman is not spent being pregnant. So estradiol, the dominant estrogen produced by the ovary, is really the master of metabolic homeostasis. And by that, I mean it regulates every metabolic process in the body. And this is what is so key and not recognized by including very few doctors. And that is that reproductive functions, which are clearly controlled by estrogen, right? And metabolic functions. And metabolic functions are the production of energy, distribution, and use of energy in every organ system of the body. It's like the spark of life. We know that there's electrical activity in the brain, in the heart. That's all about energy and metabolism. And nature made it so that a healthy woman would be fertile. And in fact, ancient tribes knew that fertility was a vital sign of health. They had fertility gods. But now in our current society, we spend much of a woman's life trying to get rid of her fertility so that she doesn't have babies when she's not ready, without recognizing that estradiol, the estrogen made by ovaries, is the master of every function in the body, of maintaining the health and function of every organ system. And so estrogen is the master hormone. I think of it as the glue that actually connects every organ system to the reproductive system, so that you have one whole, one healthy woman who can be successful at conceiving, having an uncomplicated pregnancy, deliver a healthy baby, nurse that baby, and then do it over again a few times, and then raise them all to their sexual maturity. That takes a healthy body in every sense of the word. So fertility is about the overall global health of the woman, which absolutely requires estrogen. So that is my favorite. I hate the term estrogen dominance. I'm on a campaign to get rid of it, but I know I'm in the minority because there are very few stages of life when the ovaries actually overproduce estrogen. Most of the time when people are talking about estrogen dominance, they're talking about imbalances and progesterone deficiencies. And sometimes they're talking about xenoestrogens, the ubiquitous chemicals in our environment that have effects on hormones. So, and the most common one that's affected, the master hormone, is estrogen. So that's why most of the endocrine disruptors are xenoestrogens. So a xenoestrogen can impact the production, distribution, utilization, elimination, the receptor function. Virtually everything that a hormone does can be interfered with by these chemicals. And they talk about estrogen dominance, and they're talking about a body filled with endocrine disruptors. So, or they're talking about difficulty with detoxification of estrogen. Not that estrogen is evil, it's made in too much quantity or something, and we should shut it down, but rather that you're making the wrong metabolites or you're not utilizing and excreting it properly. So that's a whole different problem. And the solution isn't to get rid of our ovarian function. It's to deal with the gut, the liver, and so forth. So the only time in a woman's life when there is true estrogen dominance, where the ovaries overproduce estrogen, is in the transitional or perimenopausal phase, because what happens is you have ovaries that are still capable of making estrogen. They still have eggs, but it's on the decline. So you have this steady decline, but it's marked by spikes. So it's down, 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 with a spike of estrogen, down, and a spike. And that's because there's this disequilibrium between the gonadotropins, the hormones like FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone, produced by the pituitary gland based on what it's being told by the brain. When the brain senses, oh, I don't have enough estrogen, tell the pituitary to put out its signals to tell the ovaries to make more. Well, then the ovaries still can. So you get this giant overshoot of estrogen, and then it plummets again because it's still going down. Then the brain says more estrogen, and it goes through that. So you get these spikes, and occasionally you can measure estradiol levels in a perimenopausal woman, and you get crazy high levels. You'll get 600, 700. Normally the peak is 300 something. So, and that's why it's so fascinating, because you get this spike of the gonadotropins, like really high FSH. Well, that's what we do when we try to get multiple eggs out for egg retrieval for women who are going through like in vitro fertilization, and they want to collect, or women want to have frozen eggs. So they want to do a big collection. So they want to hyperovulate them. Well, this can happen in the perimenopausal system during those years because of the overshoot and the overproduction of the FSH. So occasionally, that high level of FSH will not only cause a lot of estrogen to be produced, but to get 2 eggs to ovulate. So twinning with fraternal twins, the highest time in a woman's life when that occurs is during the menopausal transition. And so you have a woman who thinks that she's not very fertile, maybe she isn't, but she's not sterile. She still can produce eggs and ovulate, and she puts out 2, and suddenly she's like 42 years old and she's got a set of twins.
Do women struggle with their weight more than men?
So women are designed to hold on to their fat. Now, we don't usually like it, but we have to think of most everything in the body as how did evolution create this? It's always about survival, and survival for the reason of successful reproduction. So that's why women have very different immune systems from men, very different hormone systems, and our metabolisms are different. And because of the way that our bodies are designed, we're designed to hold on to fat. So it's much harder for women to lose body fat compared to men. And that's because women need to have that extra body fat. If they get pregnant and there's say, a famine. So we evolved many, many thousands of years ago when we had times of great famine, when we didn't have enough food, but reproduction still would continue to some degree, usually less in the winter, for example. We know that there are seasonality as far as fertility. That's why if anyone ever saw the Disney Bambi, they say all the babies are born in the spring, and there's a reason for that. Everything is about survival. So you'd have babies born in the spring when food is abundant, so the mom can fatten up and then fatten up their little babies and then get through the lean times or the cold and the lack of food times of the winter. Well, women's bodies were designed to hold on to fat so that they could have enough fat to get through a pregnancy if there's not enough food, and to be able to feed a baby when they're nursing if there's not enough food around. So we have to accept that. We are simply different. Our mitochondria function differently. We burn fat differently. So we have to say, well, fat is okay. There was a time when a few decades ago, when the vision of what a perfect woman was Twiggy. I don't know, nothing against Twiggy, but it was like a very stick-like woman. And women are designed to be a little bit more Rubenesque, to have a little bit more butt and thigh fat, a little bit more curvy, and that's okay. What we don't want is the visceral fat. And that's really the fat that goes into our organs. Like you can get not just fatty liver, you can get fatty heart, fatty bone, fatty muscle. And of course, we see this happening in two different types of scenarios. One is pretty universally during the menopausal transition and going into menopause, because estrogen directs fat to be produced and to be deposited in the girly spots, like, the hips and the thighs, okay, and the butt. That's okay. That's healthy fat. And when you don't have enough estrogen, then the whole body systems become dysregulated and you go to the default, which is belly and visceral fat. And that's the kind of fat that creates metabolic disarray. People get insulin resistant. They're more prone to cardiovascular disease. And now we know that it's linked to every inflammatory condition like osteoporosis and the neuroinflammation that leads to cognitive decline, mood problems. So estrogen should be embraced for its ability to help us to make and store fat in our healthy areas. And that's all about reproductive success. But recognize that after, when we don't, or during times if we have endocrine disruptors, or we eat all the wrong foods and get disruption of our metabolism and our hormone production. And for example, people who are working in the middle of the night, women who work at night are much more prone to weight gain and metabolic dysfunctions, insulin resistance, diabetes, mood problems, because it dysregulates all of our systems. And then we go to the default of belly fat. So women are designed to hold on to their fat. They lose weight more slowly, with more difficulty, but we should recognize the differences in where the fat is located so that we don't worry so much about a little bit of extra, we'll call it safety fat, the fat that we put on our hips and butt, and worry much more about the visceral and belly fat that actually can cut our lives in terms of lifespan and health span.
What are other hormones related to weight and appetite?
All of the hormones have a beautiful synergy together, which is often also not recognized. For example, thyroid hormone. So thyroid is well recognized as involved in metabolism. If you have low thyroid, you're going to gain weight, you're going to be sluggish, you're going to have dry skin, you're going to have constipation, hair loss, and foggy brain. So it's all about creation of energy. Metabolism is thyroid. Now, this is an interesting fact. Estrogen upregulates thyroid receptors so that thyroid works better. So it's an interesting thing. In menopause, women have obviously no production of estrogen from their ovaries. And even if they have normal thyroid levels on a blood test, they may have all the symptoms of being hypothyroid that I just mentioned. And they go to their doctor and the doctor says, oh no, it's another woman with a psychiatric problem. I guess I better put her on Prozac because obviously these are all in her head, but they're actually in her body. And of course, the head is part of the body. But women who are in menopause can have the symptoms of hypothyroidism even with normal thyroid levels. So think of it as, most people know there's insulin resistance. That's when the insulin is not working properly with the receptor and the glucose isn't being properly transported into the cells across the cell membrane. So the body makes more insulin to try to compensate, and that's insulin resistance. Well, you can also have receptor resistance to any hormone, including thyroid. So you can think of menopause also as a time of thyroid receptor resistance. But it can also happen in younger aged women because, once again, endocrine disruptors can also affect thyroid. So thyroid is very key, but it's also involved with estrogen. But then how about adrenal, like you mentioned? Well, thyroid hormone is also very much interplaying with adrenal hormones, with the cortisol. So stress. So we know that stress can cause weight gain. Well, how the heck is that? There's no calories in stress. How can you gain weight from being stressed? Because it's not just what you eat, it's how you utilize it. So it's your metabolic rate. So when you have a lot of stress, there is only one stress response. It doesn't matter if the stress is because you're worried about a test. It doesn't matter if it's marital problems, financial problems, or if you're sick, if you have a chronic infection, if you're ill, if you have COVID, if you have anything that's a stress, chronic pain, like injury or back problems or hip problems, osteoarthritis problems, anything that creates stress in the body yields exactly the same response. And what is that response? Prepare for famine. That's how humans have survived through all these thousands of years. You don't have to be super smart. You just have to be super effective in terms of utilizing the energy and slowing your metabolism when you're faced with famine. That's why Homo sapiens have not become extinct and Neanderthals became extinct, even though they were smarter than Homo sapiens. Because if there's no food around, it doesn't matter what your IQ is. How is your body going to utilize what's available? So when you're under stress, your metabolism will naturally slow so that it's assuming that you're not going to have food. So you've got to then slow your metabolism like a brownout if you have a heat and they say, don't turn on the air conditioner, use less, right? So you're going to slow your metabolism so that whatever fat stores you have will last longer before you basically have no fat stores left. And then you start eating up your lean body mass. And that's horrific. You start eating up your organs and your muscle and so on. And then, of course, then you'll be under starvation conditions and you could die. So you have to be efficient when you're under stress. But unfortunately, most of us who are under stress are actually not in a famine, right? So we don't need that. We're still eating, but the body still has the same stress response. So what happens is part of the stress response is increasing the production of cortisol. Cortisol is an amazing hormone. It's the only hormone in the body that if you don't have any, you will die within 24 hours. The only hormone in the body. It's so critical for survival. And the problem is when you have chronic stress, you have chronic excessive production of cortisol. So now you're in a state of chronically slowing your metabolic rate. So how does it do it? Well, one way it does it is by working with the thyroid hormone. And it converts the ability of the body to make free T3, to make the thyroid hormone called T3, which is the active thyroid hormone that actually creates all the effects with metabolism, from the storage form of thyroid hormone, which is called T4, thyroxine. Instead, it takes the T4 and diverts it down a different pathway to make reverse T3. Reverse T3 is the mirror image of T3, and it binds to the same receptors, but it acts as a blocker. So basically, it sits in the receptor, preventing the T3 from getting on and doing anything. It's just blocking it. And it also takes more of the T4 and converts it into the reverse T3 instead of turning it to T3. So you have the double whammy. You have less T3 and you have more reverse T3. So effectively, you're becoming hypothyroid, even though your body has totally normal T4 production. And so you can have all the symptoms of hypothyroidism. But the solution is not to give more T3. A lot of people think, well, just give me more T3. But that's creating a tremendous additional stress on the body, because then you're giving mixed signals, because the body is saying, I'm totally stressed out. I've got to slow my metabolism. I'm preparing for famine. And I have all this cortisol circulating, because cortisol also reduces the inflammatory response when it's acute, but when it's chronic, it actually increases the inflammatory response. It's so that if you get injured, you'll be able to still function instead of being overwhelmed by pain and swelling. So it's all about survival, but now it's chronic and it's dysregulated. So if you actually give too much thyroid to people who are in this state, you can actually trigger cardiac arrhythmias, tachyarrhythmias, make them feel terrible because the body is trying to slow it, and then you're putting it in and you're revving. It's like putting in a car, you're pushing as hard as you can on the brakes and the gas at the same time. I mean, that car doesn't know what it's doing. So what you have to do instead is work on the stress. So you have to work on getting the adrenal gland, which is not broken, but to calm its production of cortisol by telling the body things are all right. And that's where mind-body medicine is real hardcore science-based medicine. It's not woo-woo. It's hardcore science-based medicine, because what it does is it downregulates the sympathetic, which women are more prone to in the autonomic nervous system, and upregulates vagal tone so that you have more parasympathetic and more calming effect. And women are more prone to stress effects in terms of weight because they are more prone with their autonomic nervous system to the stressor side than to the relaxation side. So yes, all of these hormones come into play. And estrogen, of course, links to all of these, because much of what happens with stress is that it completely dysregulates your circadian rhythm. The master clock that sits in the brain, in the hypothalamus, on top of the optic nerve, which can sense light and dark, and also some nutrient sensing as well. So it also can tell if you're starving or if you're overfeeding. So there are also contributions from nutrients. But predominantly it's light and dark. And when you're under stress, you don't sleep well. You have decreased melatonin production, which then makes you more inflamed, because melatonin is also a key antioxidant. And there are receptors on the ovary for melatonin. Melatonin is critical for ovulation and ovarian health as well. So all of these things come into play, and you get circadian rhythm dysfunction, sleep dysfunction, and estrogen is part of the regulation system of the circadian rhythm as well. So when women go through menopause, for example, they have dysregulation of all these systems. So they end up in a chronic state of inflammation and stress and functional hypothyroidism. So all of these things are coming into play to affect women's global health status in menopause, and nobody's recognizing this and what this means. But of course, you can create comparables if you give chemical hormones, aka hormonal contraception, unfortunately, which is linked, by the way, with significant increases in emotional distress, depression, even suicide in young women, because it's going into all these systems and messing around with them. So all of these systems are in play, and it's a beautiful synergy when things are right, or metabolic chaos when things are wrong.
Thank you for your interview. Thank you for listening to the Woman's Doctor podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, be sure to share this with the women in your life and rate and review this show.